They didn't worship a planet, they locked it away. The first civilization described reality as enclosed, sealed, around a colossal prison in space. The question that terrifies them echoes across time. What happens if it is ever opened? Fragments pressed into clay 5,000 years ago speak of boundaries drawn before memory, of skies measured and sealed, of human beings placed inside a system already complete. Between temple archives and royal inscriptions, something persists, not as myth, but as record, as if the earliest writers were not imagining their cosmos, but transcribing it. Tonight, let the noise recede. Let the hours slow. If you find yourself drawn to stories that live in the spaces between history and recognition, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. And if you're still awake, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Long before Babylon, before Egypt carved its first dynasty, there were hands in southern Mesopotamia pressing wedge-shaped marks into damp clay, slowly, deliberately, as though each impression carried consequence beyond language. The earliest Sumerian tablets do not arrive with fanfare. At first glance, they seem almost disappointing. Lists of barley rations, records of labor assignments, inventories of livestock and land. Thousands of them, stacked in temple storerooms, buried in administrative quarters, catalogued by French and British archaeologists in the 1800s. But beneath this bureaucratic surface lies a tension that has troubled scholars ever since. These texts emerge already literate, already standardized, already precise. Writing does not evolve here. It does not stumble through pictographic infancy or experimental phases. In Uruk, around 3200 BC, cuneiform script appears fully operational, complete with grammatical structures, numerical systems, and institutional terminology, as though it had been designed elsewhere and imported whole. The Sumerians themselves never claimed invention. In king lists carved into stone, in temple hymns copied across centuries, in cosmological texts preserved by scribal schools, knowledge is attributed not to human discovery, but to transfer. Laws, measurements, astronomy, agriculture, even writing itself, described as gifts from beings who descended from An, the high heaven. The Anunnaki, the word appears again and again, etched into cylinder seals, embedded in administrative records, invoked in royal legitimation. Later translators render it simply as those who from heaven to earth came, but the etymology is less neutral. An, the unreachable sky. Ki, the earth heavy and bound. The Anunnaki are those who move between, not gods in the moral sense, but authorities of placement, overseers of structure, regulators of domain. And in text after text, humanity appears not as a culmination, but as a response. The Atrahasis epic, reconstructed from tablets found in Nineveh and Sippar, preserves one of the oldest creation accounts in human record. The narrative is blunt. The Igigi, lesser divine beings tasked with maintaining the land, rebel. They refuse to dig canals, to carry earth, to labor without rest. The solution is not reconciliation, it is manufacture. A new entity is designed, humans, mixed from clay and the blood of a slain god, shaped explicitly to bear the burden of work, to replace exhausted overseers, to maintain the system. The text does not celebrate this. It states it plainly, almost administratively. Let man assume the drudgery of the gods. There is no covenant here, no divine blessing, only function, purpose assigned from above, embedded at the moment of formation. What lingers is not the myth itself, but the tone, and what it implies about the world humanity inherits. Because threaded through these early tablets is language not of wilderness or potential, but of enclosure. Earth is described as a measured domain. Skies are structured, layered, assigned. Even the cosmos itself is divided with precision. An above, key below, and between them, the atmosphere ruled by Enlil, Lord of the Command, art keeper of the air humans breathe. This is not poetic metaphor, it is spatial documentation. Temple records describe the heavens as bounded. Astronomical tablets track celestial bodies, not for wonder, but for regulation. Planetary movements linked to permissions, cycles governing planting and harvest, rituals timed to star positions, as though the sky itself enforced timing and behavior. Omen texts preserved in later Babylonian libraries trace these practices back to Sumerian originals, where observation is inseparable from compliance. The universe, as recorded, is not infinite. It is organized. And then there is Enlil himself, perhaps the most telling figure in the early records. In later mythology, he becomes unpredictable, wrathful, even destructive. But in the oldest layers of text, he is something colder, a regulator. At when humanity multiplies too rapidly, when noise disrupts the order of things, Enlil does not guide or instruct. He reduces. Plague, drought, famine. And finally, the flood, described in Sumerian sources not as divine wrath against sin, but as correction. The problem is not moral failure, it is imbalance. Humanity's noise disturbs the overseers, the population exceeds sustainable limits, and so the system is reset. Only Enki, the engineer god, the rule bender, intervenes. Not from compassion, the texts suggest, but perhaps from practical concern. A complete erasure would eliminate the solution itself. One man is warned, a boat is built, the flood recedes, and then new measures are implemented. Biological ones. After the waters retreat, lifespan is shortened, infertility is introduced, infant mortality rises. Oh, these are not curses in the moral sense. They are adjustments, limits placed directly into human biology, as one would recalibrate a mechanism that had overproduced. The Sumerian king list records this shift explicitly. Before the flood, kings reign for tens of thousands of years. After, lifespans drop sharply, stabilizing within recognizable human ranges. The boundary is marked, documented, preserved. What unsettles is not the flood story itself. Versions appear across cultures. What unsettles is the framing, the absence of sin, the presence of quota. These were not marginal tales whispered at the edges of society. They were central, copied in scribal schools for over 1,000 years, taught as history, not allegory. Kings legitimized their rule by claiming descent from the Anunnaki, and temples were aligned to stars associated with these beings. Ritual calendars structured daily life according to celestial cycles governed by forces that, the records insist, never truly departed. They simply withdrew. And then there is the architecture itself. The ziggurats, massive stepped structures rising across Sumerian cities, are often described as temples, but their names suggest something more specific. House of the foundation of heaven and earth. Platform of the lofty domain. Not symbols of connection, but points of it. Physical anchors. Some tablets refer to the bond between heaven and earth as a durankia, a cosmic mooring. Not abstract, not metaphorical. A fixed link that, once established, required maintenance. And humanity, positioned between soil and sky, becomes the maintenance class. Tilling the soil, feeding the gods through offering, performing rituals with precision so the connection does not weaken. The world is not theirs to explore or expand. It is theirs to preserve within limits already drawn. Later civilizations soften this. Babylonian revisions give the Anunnaki moral attributes. Assyrian hymns transform them into judges of the underworld, arbiters of justice. But in the older Sumerian strata, morality is absent. The cosmos is not good or evil. It is functional, hierarchical, closed. Modern scholars often dismiss the darker implications by pointing to metaphor, to literary device, to the symbolic nature of myth. Yet the consistency resists easy dismissal. Different cities, different scribes, different political regimes across 1,500 years of recorded history. And yet the core remains intact. Humanity created, an assigned, managed, limited. What is rarely discussed is how deeply this structure may have shaped everything that followed. The language of servitude echoes forward through millennia. Humans created to serve a higher power, earth as testing ground, heaven as unreachable authority, the fall, the flood, the shortening of life. These motifs do not originate in isolation. They flow from older clay. And if the first civilization to write did not describe the world as a place of open potential, but as a carefully administered enclosure, then the question is not whether we should believe their cosmology, The question is whether we ever stopped living inside it. To understand how deeply this enclosure was documented, we must begin where writing itself begins, not with hymns or epics, but with the mundane precision of clay pressed into inventory. The earliest tablets recovered from the Sumerian city of Uruk date to 3200 BC. They were found buried in temple complexes, stacked in administrative chambers, filed in what can only be described as archives. Tens of thousands of them, small, rectangular, covered in rows of wedge-shaped impressions. Archaeologists expected poetry, creation stories, prayers to the gods. What they found were ration lists, grain allocations for workers, livestock counts by pen and season, land divisions measured in IKU, units so precise they were used for over 2,000 years without modification. Lists of labourers by name, task, and output. Daily bread distributions tracked down to the individual loaf. There is no preamble on these tablets, no invocation of divine favour, no appeal to higher meaning, just numbers, names, assignments. Writing, in its oldest form, was not expressive. It was managerial, and it arrives without ancestry. No rough sketches, no experimental symbols struggling toward coherence. The script of Uruk IV is already systematic, grammatically consistent, numerically advanced, institutionally embedded. As though the infrastructure for recording had been waiting and only needed activation. What is absent is as telling as what remains. There are no freedom narratives in these early archives, no stories of escape, ascension, or liberation. No myths promising humans a higher destiny or a realm beyond labor. The afterlife, when mentioned at all in later Sumerian texts, is not a reward. It is a shadow place beneath the earth, where the dead persist in dim awareness, eating dust, drinking clay water. Upward movement is not described as available. Even the layout of the earliest cities reflects this. Uruk, Eridu, Ur, each built around a temple ziggurat complex that dominates the landscape. These structures are not simply religious. They are economic centrals, storehouses, distribution hubs, administrative headquarters. Surrounding them, worker quarters laid out in grids, outer walls with controlled gates, agricultural fields extending in measured plots, irrigation channels dug with geometric precision. Everything assigned, everything regulated. The city is not a gathering of free people. It is an organized workforce housed around a supply depot. And the texts treat this arrangement as pre-existing. Whilst there is no record of negotiation, no moment where humans choose this structure. It is simply described as the order of things. Kings do not establish rule, they receive it from heaven. Laws are not debated, they are transcribed from divine decree. Even the calendar itself, with its carefully counted days and ritual observances, is presented as handed down, not invented. One tablet from the early dynastic period, catalogued in the Louvre, records a land survey. Boundaries are marked not by natural features, but by divine assignment. Fields belong to specific gods. Temples own the earth. Humans work it under terms already established. Another text, fragmentary but consistent across multiple copies, lists the duties of humanity in blunt language: to maintain the shrines, to feed the gods, to keep the canals clear, and to ensure the offerings arrive on time. There is no transcendence in this, no promise of elevation, only function. The gods themselves, in these early records, do not inspire. They allocate. Enlil assigns the plough. Enki grants the knowledge of irrigation. Inanna oversees the storehouse. They are not distant and unknowable. They are present, territorial, and exacting, and they do not visit to save. What remains, spread across thousands of tablets and hundreds of years, is a portrait of a world already divided when humans arrive, already claimed, already measured. The heavens are above and inaccessible. The underworld is below and inescapable. Humanity occupies the space between, not as inheritors, but as occupants. The tablets do not mourn this, but they also do not celebrate it. They simply record it. Art with the same precision used to count jars of oil and bales of wool, as though the enclosure was not a revelation to be pondered, but a condition to be documented. And if writing was invented not to capture imagination, but to manage reality, then what kind of reality required such meticulous management? What were the Sumerians keeping track of, and who taught them to count so carefully? The answer may lie not in what they measured, but in what they believed could not be crossed. Sumerian cosmology does not describe the universe as infinite. It describes it as structured, divided into 3 fixed domains, each with defined boundaries and restricted access. An, the heavens above, unreachable and reserved. Ki, the earth below, assigned for labor and life. Kur, the underworld beneath, sealed and unavoidable. These are not poetic abstractions. They are spatial designations, repeated across temple hymns, cylinder seals, and royal inscriptions with the consistency of architectural blueprints. The cosmos, as recorded, is not open. It is enclosed, and each layer is separated by something solid. In the Sumerian creation hymn, preserved in multiple copies across Nippur and Ur, the sky is described not as empty space, but as a firmament, a hard surface separating the waters above from the world below. Stars move along fixed paths etched into this surface. The sun and moon travel prescribed routes, rising and setting through gates that open and close at designated times. These gates are not metaphors. Astronomical texts from the Old Babylonian period, rooted in earlier Sumerian observations, refer to celestial doors and opening times. Planets are tracked not for wonder, but for compliance. Each assigned a specific course, a specific speed, a specific zone of operation. Deviations are noted, recorded, interpreted as warnings. The heavens, in this framework, are not wild or mysterious. They are regulated, and access is restricted. In Sumerian myth, no human ascends to An, no mortal crosses into the high domain. Even kings, who claim divine lineage, do not rise. They rule on earth and descend to Kur when they die. The vertical movement is unidirectional, downward. The afterlife is described in the Descent of Inanna, one of the oldest narrative poems recovered intact. The underworld is not punishment, it is destination. Inanna, a goddess, must pass through 7 gates to enter, surrendering a piece of her power at each threshold. Even divine beings cannot move freely between realms. For humans, the descent is permanent. The dead do not rise. They do not return. Sumerian burial texts describe the underworld as a place of dust and silence, where the deceased exist in shadow, stripped of agency, consuming clay and drinking stagnant water. There is no resurrection, no reincarnation, no escape clause. The cosmology offers no way out. What is striking is not the bleakness. Many ancient cultures describe somber afterlives. What is striking is the architectural precision. The universe is not a mystery to be explored. It is a system to be maintained. And humanity is positioned in the only layer with obligations. An is the domain of the gods, off limits, elevated, observing. Kur is the domain of the dead, irreversible, subterranean, final. Ki is where humans labor, not by choice, by placement. Temple texts describe Earth as the designated realm assigned at the moment of creation. In one fragmentary hymn, the boundary between heaven and earth is referred to as a durankia, a cosmic bond that must not break. Rituals are performed to maintain it. Offerings are made to stabilize it. The ziggurat, rising in tears, is not symbolic. It is functional architecture, a physical anchor point between realms. Humanity does not build upward to reach the gods. The gods descend part way, and humans meet them there. Even celestial observation reinforces enclosure. The oldest star catalogues, copied from Sumerian originals, do not describe the sky as limitless. They describe zones, regions assigned to specific deities, each governing a portion of the firmament. The ecliptic is divided into sections. The zodiac, later formalized by the Babylonians, originates here. 12 divisions, 12 overseers, 12 locked gates through which the sun must pass. The stars themselves are called mol, a word that also means to shine, but carries the connotation of being set in place, not wandering, not free, fixed. And then there is the boundary most carefully guarded, the threshold between life and death. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, rooted in earlier Sumerian tales, the hero seeks immortality after witnessing his companion's death. He journeys to the edge of the world, crosses the waters of death, and finds Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, the only human granted eternal life. But Utnapishtim does not inspire hope. Or he tells Gilgamesh that immortality was a singular exception, granted once, never to be repeated. The gods, after the flood, ensured that no human would again bypass death. Biological limits were embedded. The gate was sealed. Gilgamesh returns empty-handed. The message is unambiguous. The boundary is permanent. What is rarely acknowledged is how thoroughly this cosmology removes transcendence. There is no spiritual evolution, no enlightenment that elevates, no path from earth to heaven. The layers are fixed. The gates are closed. Humanity is contained within a vertical slice of existence, bordered above and below by domains they cannot enter. And every text that describes this, hymns, omens, king lists, flood narratives, treats it not as tragedy, but as structure, as fact. If the universe itself was described as sealed and layered, where exactly did humans fit inside it? Not at the center, not at the summit. Somewhere in between, working, counted, and bound. Not at the center, not at the summit. Somewhere in between, working, counted, and bound. But the question remains, why were humans placed there at all? The answer, preserved in one of the oldest coherent narratives ever recovered, is not spiritual. It is operational. The Atrahasis epic, reconstructed from fragments found in Nineveh, Sippar, and Babylon, survives in multiple versions spanning over 1,000 years. The oldest copies date to the Old Babylonian period, around 1700 BC, but linguistic analysis traces the core narrative back to Sumerian originals composed centuries earlier. It does not begin with humanity. It begins with a problem. In the earliest age, the text explains, the Igigi, lesser divine beings, were assigned the labor of maintaining the earth. They dug the rivers, they cleared the channels, they carried baskets of soil to build the banks. For 40 years, they worked without complaint. Then, the text says, they grew weary. The Igigi gathered in secret. They burned their tools. They marched to the house of Enlil, the overseer, and refused to continue. The rebellion is described not as moral outrage, but as exhaustion. They had been working too long. The burden was too great. Enlil's response is telling. He does not punish them. He does not negotiate. He convenes a council and asks, how can the work continue without the workers? The solution is proposed by Enki, the engineer god. Create a substitute. Not a servant in the symbolic sense, a biological replacement, a being capable of labor, intelligent enough to follow instruction but limited enough to remain controlled. The text is explicit about the method. Clay is mixed with the blood of a slain god, one of the rebels, killed to provide the necessary template. From this mixture, humans are formed. 7 males, 7 females. Designed, the text says, to bear the yoke so the gods may rest. There is no blessing in this creation, no breath of divine love, no moment of transcendence. Humanity is shaped to solve a labor shortage, and the language used is not metaphorical. The word for human in Akkadian, awalum, shares roots with terms for worker and servant. The word for creation, banu, is the same used for constructing tools and shaping clay vessels. Humans are manufactured. What is absent is any suggestion that this was an act of generosity. The Agigi are relieved of their burden. The system continues. Humanity assumes the role that had become untenable for divine beings. The Enuma Elish, a later Babylonian creation epic, echoes this framework. After the god Marduk defeats Tiamat and establishes cosmic order, he declares that humans will be created to do the service of the gods, that they might be at ease. Again, service, ease for the overseers, burden for the created. Even Sumerian creation hymns, less narrative and more liturgical, repeat the formula. One text from Nippur describes humans as fashioned to maintain the shrines, to keep the offerings regular, to ensure the gods are fed, not to seek enlightenment, not to ascend, to maintain. And the striking consistency across centuries suggests this was not poetic invention. It was foundational belief. As kings invoked it to justify forced labor. Temples cited it to explain compulsory service. Scribes taught it in schools as the origin of human obligation. But if this was the design, if humans were created to be manageable, limited, and functional, then something went wrong. Because the Atrahasis epic does not end with creation, it continues. 1,200 years pass within the text. Humanity multiplies, cities grow, populations expand. And then the narrative takes a turn that scholars rarely emphasize. The gods begin to complain, not about disobedience, not about sin, about noise. The text describes humanity's clamor as unbearable. The sound of cities disrupts the rest of the divine overseers. Enlil, unable to sleep, declares that the population has grown too dense. The balance has been lost. And his response is not moral correction. It is reduction. First, he sends disease. Populations drop. Then drought. Then famine. Each time, humanity recovers. Each time, the numbers rise again. The interventions are described in administrative language. Adjustments, corrections, implementations. There is no anger, no wrath, just recalibration. Until finally, Enlil decides on a permanent solution. A flood, not to cleanse sin, not to reset morality, to reduce the population to sustainable levels and prevent future overgrowth. The text is clear. Humanity was not supposed to become this numerous. The solution had exceeded its parameters. And if humans were created to work, but became too many, too loud, too aware, then what measures were taken to ensure it would never happen again? The tablets do not leave this question unanswered. But the answer is not one of mercy. In the Atrahasis epic, the flood is not the first intervention. It is the last in a sequence. Before the waters rise, Enlil implements 3 prior corrections, each recorded with the same clinical detachment used to document grain rations. First, plague. The text describes a divine assembly where Enlil declares that humanity has become too numerous. He sends disease. Populations collapse. Cities. Through a society that had learned to regulate itself. But regulation requires architecture. And when archaeologists excavated the ancient cities of Sumer, Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Lagash, they did not find organic sprawl. They found precision, grids, zones, boundaries enforced not by walls alone, but by spatial logic so consistent it could only have been intentional. The cities mirror the cosmos. At the center of every major Sumerian settlement stands the temple complex, not as a place of worship in the modern sense, but as an economic nucleus. The ziggurat rises in tiers, but surrounding it are storage chambers, administrative halls, workshops, and granaries. These are not spiritual structures. They are distribution centers. Tablets recovered from the temple precincts at Ur reveal their true function. Thousands of records cataloging incoming grain, outgoing rations, textile production, livestock counts, labor assignments by name and task. The temple owns the land. It manages the surplus. It allocates resources. Priests are listed not by spiritual rank, but by administrative role. Overseers of the storehouse, managers of irrigation, scribes of the ration lists. They are bureaucrats. One archive from Girsu, dating to 2400 BC, details the daily bread distribution for temple workers. Each person is assigned a specific quantity based on their role. More for laborers, less for children. Precise allotments for women in textile workshops. The system is granular, calculated, enforced. Nothing is left to chance. And literacy, the tool that makes this possible, is not democratized. Scribal schools train only a small class. Admission is restricted. The vast majority of the population cannot read the tablets that govern their rations, their work schedules, their assigned plots of land. Knowledge is controlled, passed down through families connected to the temple or the palace. The ability to interpret the system is itself a privilege, which means most people live inside a structure they cannot read. While city layouts reinforce this hierarchy with geometric clarity. At Ur, excavations revealed distinct residential zones, large homes near the temple for elite families, smaller standardized houses in worker districts, and dense quarters for laborers near the city walls. Movement between zones is channeled through controlled streets. Gates regulate access. The city is not egalitarian. It is stratified. And the stratification is spatial. Even burial practices reflect this. Royal tombs at Ur contain elaborate grave goods, sacrificed attendants, objects of gold and lapis lazuli. Commoner graves are simple pits with few possessions. The afterlife, it seems, is also zoned. Death does not equalize. What is striking is how little room exists for deviation. Labor assignments are inherited. Sons of farmers farm, and sons of craftsmen work the same trades. Daughters of weavers weave. Social mobility is not structurally supported. Roles are fixed at birth. One text from the early dynastic period, a legal dispute over land, reveals how deeply assignment is embedded. A man claims a plot of land belonged to his family, from the time when heaven and earth were separated. The language suggests ownership is not recent. It is primordial, established in the cosmic order itself. Land does not change hands easily. It was assigned. It remains assigned. And then there is the question of time. Sumerian workers did not own their schedules. Temple records show labor organized in rotating shifts, assigned by the 10-day week, synchronized with ritual calendars. Planting, harvest, canal maintenance, all occur according to celestial cycles interpreted by priests. The population does not decide when to work. The calendar decides. This is not accidental. It is structural. The cosmic order, an above, ki below, kur beneath, is replicated in the city itself. The temple at the summit, the palace adjacent, the workers radiating outward in concentric zones, the dead buried below. Vertical hierarchy made horizontal. But if every aspect of life, space, labor, literacy, time, identity, is determined by a system that predates individual existence, then where does choice enter? Archaeological evidence suggests it doesn't. No Sumerian city shows signs of democratic assembly spaces, no councils, no public forums. Decisions are made in the temple or the palace and transmitted downward. The population receives assignments, not options. And the records show no resistance movements, no revolutions, and no uprisings that successfully dismantled the structure. Either the system was too stable to challenge, or resistance was so thoroughly suppressed it left no trace. Or, perhaps most disturbing, the population accepted it. Because if you are born into a world where roles are assigned, labor is measured, time is controlled, and the cosmos itself is described as enclosed, why would you imagine an alternative? The enclosure is not just physical, it is conceptual. And by the time a child in Ur learns to count, to measure grain, to recite hymns praising the gods who established the order, the structure is no longer external. It is internal. If society itself enforced the enclosure, was there any room left for resistance, or even awareness? The tablets suggest one anomaly, one god who repeatedly broke the rules, and one gift that should never have been given. His name appears in contexts that do not fit the pattern. Enki, Lord of the Absu, the subterranean freshwater realm, god of wisdom, craft, and something the other deities seem wary of: improvisation. While Enlil enforces boundaries, Enki crosses them. While An remains distant and Enlil regulates, Enki intervenes, not to maintain order, but to disrupt it in ways that repeatedly benefit humanity. The texts do not frame this as rebellion, but they do not frame it as obedience either. In the Atrahasis epic, when Enlil sends the flood to reduce humanity, it is Enki who warns Atrahasis, not openly. The text describes Enki speaking to a reed wall, knowing Atrahasis is listening on the other side. A technicality, a loophole. He does not defy the decree, he circumvents it, and humanity survives. In another text, Enki and the world order, the god travels across the earth distributing knowledge, irrigation techniques, metallurgy, shipbuilding, the domestication of animals, the measurement of fields. These are not abstract spiritual gifts. They are technical skills, practical tools that allow humans to do more than they were designed to do. The question the texts never answer is, why? Why does Enki give humans capabilities beyond their original function? If humanity was created to perform basic labor, digging, planting, maintaining, why teach them to smelt copper, navigate rivers, engineer complex agriculture? One possibility, suggested by the narrative structure, is that Enki sees something in humanity the other gods do not. Potential. In the myth Enki and Ninmah, the goddess Ninmah challenges Enki by creating flawed humans, beings with disabilities, deformities, conditions that make them useless for labor. Enki responds by finding a role for each one. He does not discard them. He integrates them. The text suggests he values function beyond utility. But there is another reading, quieter and more unsettling. Perhaps Enki is not acting out of compassion. Perhaps he is stress testing the system, seeing how far humanity can be pushed before something breaks or awakens. Because across multiple narratives a pattern emerges. Humans receive knowledge and immediately exceed their design parameters. In the Epic of Adapa, a Sumerian story later adopted in Akkadian, a human sage is granted wisdom by Enki. Adapa becomes so knowledgeable that he is summoned to heaven to stand before Anu. As the high god offers him the bread of life and water of life, immortality. But Enki, before Adapa ascends, warns him not to eat or drink anything offered in heaven. Adapa obeys. He refuses the food and water, and he loses immortality. The text does not explain Enki's motive. Did he protect Adapa from a test he would fail? Or did he prevent humanity from crossing a threshold they were never meant to reach? Either way, the boundary holds, but the knowledge remains. And this is where the system reveals its flaw. Humanity was designed to labor, to obey, to maintain the established order. But the gift of awareness, language, craft, observation, memory, introduces a variable the original design did not account for. Humans begin to ask questions. Sumerian wisdom literature, preserved in scattered proverbs and scribal exercises, shows this tension. One tablet records, "The one who knows much speaks little." Another, A scribe who does not know Sumerian, what kind of scribe is he? These are not just educational maxims. They are warnings about the relationship between knowledge and control. The more humans know, the harder they are to manage. And the texts acknowledge this problem directly. After the flood, when new regulations are implemented, shortened lifespans, biological limits, the Atrahasis epic includes a detail often overlooked. Enki proposes additional measures: the creation of priestesses who do not bear children, the introduction of infant mortality, the establishment of demons who snatch babies. These are not punishments. They are population controls embedded into human biology and social structure. But even with these limits, our humanity continues to develop. Cities grow larger, technologies advance, writing proliferates, and with it the capacity to record, compare, and remember. The very tools given to manage the system become tools that allow humans to see the system. One Sumerian proverb, stark and unsettling, survives in multiple copies. Man is the shadow of a god. A slave is the shadow of a man. But the king, he is the mirror. The hierarchy is acknowledged. But so is the reflection. If kings mirror the gods, then observing kings reveals something about the gods themselves. And once that recognition occurs, the enclosure becomes visible, not escapable, not dismantled, but visible. This is the flaw Enki introduces, not freedom, but awareness. The ability to notice that the world feels arranged, that roles are assigned, that boundaries exist, not because they are natural, but because they were drawn. The system does not collapse under this awareness. It adapts. Scribal schools teach obedience alongside literacy. Rituals reinforce cosmic order even as they acknowledge human limitation. Myths preserve the story of humanity's creation as labor, embedding subservience into origin itself. But the awareness persists. In the poem of The Righteous Sufferer, a Babylonian text rooted in earlier Sumerian traditions, a man questions why he suffers despite following all the rules. He performs the rituals. He obeys the laws. He maintains the offerings. And still, he is afflicted. His conclusion is not rebellion. It is confusion. He does not understand the gods. He cannot perceive the logic of his suffering. But he asks. And that question, why, is the crack in the foundation. Because a being designed only to obey would not ask why. A tool does not question its function, but a mind aware of structure, aware of suffering, aware that the system operates by rules it did not choose. That mind becomes something the original design did not anticipate. A variable. If awareness could not be removed, how did the system adapt to contain it? Not through force alone, not through correction, through something more efficient. Through making the enclosure so familiar, so embedded, so total, that awareness itself becomes indistinguishable from compliance. This is not speculation. It is observable in the archaeological record. Because the most disturbing aspect of Sumerian civilization is not how it began, but how long it lasted. The core structure, temple economy, divine kingship, stratified labor, ritual calendars, restricted literacy, persists for over 1,500 years with minimal variation. Cities rise and fall, dynasties change, empires conquer and collapse, but the system remains. Ur is destroyed and rebuilt. Uruk declines and resurges. Lagash wars with Umma over irrigation rights for generations. Political power shifts between city-states. Kings claim supremacy, lose it, reclaim it. And through all of it, the tablets record the same administrative language, the same cosmology, the same roles. This is not the stability of a system enforced by constant surveillance. This is the stability of a system that no longer requires enforcement, because it has become identity. Consider the ritual calendar. Early Sumerian temple texts describe festivals, offerings, and rites performed at specific times aligned with lunar and solar cycles. By the Ur-3 period, around 2100 BC, these rituals are so standardized that tablets record them as bureaucratic obligations. On the first day of the month, 3 sheep to Enlil. On the 7th, barley offerings to Inanna. On the 15th, purification rites at the temple gate. The language is administrative, not devotional. But the population performs them. Generations of families, century after century, maintaining the same cycles. Not because soldiers enforce attendance, but because ritual becomes rhythm. The calendar structures time. Time structures behavior. Behavior becomes expectation, and expectation becomes identity. One text from a scribal school, a practice tablet where students copy model phrases, includes this line: I am a scribe, and I rise before dawn. I purify my hands. I enter the tablet house. I do not speak out of turn. This is not instruction. This is self-description. The role is not something imposed from outside. It is internalized. The scribe does not obey because he fears punishment. He obeys because deviation would mean he is no longer a scribe. His function is his identity, and this extends beyond the literate class. Labor texts from Gursu list workers by name, task, and output: brickmakers, canal diggers, weavers, potters. But what is striking is the generational continuity. Sons inherit their father's assignments. Grandsons perform the same work. Over centuries, occupations solidify into lineages. Not castes in the later Indian sense. There is some mobility, some flexibility. But the default is inheritance. If your father was a metal worker, yet you train as a metal worker. If your mother wove textiles, you learn the loom. The system does not need to assign you. Your family does. And by the time you are old enough to question it, the tools are already in your hands, the techniques already learned, the role already assumed. This is the invisible boundary, not a wall, but a groove worn so deep that stepping out requires deliberate effort most people never consider. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from what does not appear in the tablets. There are no Sumerian texts describing utopia, no myths of a golden age where humans were free, no prophecies of liberation, no visions of a world restructured around equality or transcendence. When Sumerian literature describes the distant past, it describes the time before the flood, when humans lived longer, or when the gods were more present. But even then, the structure is the same. Humans labor, gods regulate, the cosmos is ordered, the past is not freer, it is simply earlier, and the future is not imagined as different. The closest the texts come to envisioning change is in omen literature, predictions of which king will rise, which city will prosper, which harvest will fail. But the framework never shifts. Kings will always descend from heaven. Harvests will always depend on ritual precision. Humanity will always occupy the space between An and Kur. The possibility of structural transformation is absent, not forbidden, not suppressed, unthought. And this is where the enclosure achieves perfection, not when the walls are highest, but when they become invisible. When the inhabitants can no longer distinguish between the structure and reality itself. One Sumerian proverb, preserved in multiple collections, reads, "A contented heart is a sacrifice to the gods." At first glance, it seems benign, but the implication is darker. Contentment is framed as offering, not personal peace, but duty. To be satisfied with your role, your labor, your place in the hierarchy, that is not freedom. It is participation in the system's maintenance. Discontent, by contrast, is not framed as injustice. It is framed as disorder. And disorder, the texts consistently suggest, invites correction. This is why the flood narrative remains so central. It is copied, taught, referenced across centuries, not as distant history, but as reminder. Humanity grew too numerous, too loud, too disruptive, and the system corrected. The story is not told to inspire fear of divine wrath. It is told to normalize regulation, to make the idea of correction seem inevitable, natural, even necessary. The enclosure does not need guards when the population believes the walls are there for their protection. But there is one detail, small and easy to overlook, that suggests the system was never quite seamless. In later periods, Babylonian, Assyrian, texts begin to include phrases that do not appear in earlier Sumerian sources. Prayers that ask not for blessings, but for understanding. Wisdom literature that admits the gods are incomprehensible. Laments that question why suffering exists despite obedience. These are not rebellions, they are tensions. Small cracks in the assumption that the system is just, comprehensible, or aligned with human well-being. The Ludlul Bel Nemeki, the poem of the righteous sufferer, describes a man who performs every ritual, follows every law, makes every offering, and still he loses everything: his health, his status, his family. He does not curse the gods. He does not abandon the system. But he admits he does not understand it. "I wish I knew that these things were pleasing to a god," he writes. "What seems good to oneself, to a god, is worthless. What in one's heart seems bad, to a god is good." The system operates by logic he cannot access, and yet he remains within it. This is not liberation, but it is awareness, the recognition that the structure exists, that it is not natural, that it operates by rules not made for human comprehension. And once that recognition occurs, even quietly, even without action, the enclosure is no longer total. Because the most perfect prison is not one with walls too high to climb. It is one where the prisoners forget they are confined, where roles feel like identity, where obedience feels like peace, where ritual feels like rhythm, where the calendar, the hierarchy, the cosmos itself are so deeply woven into daily life that they become indistinguishable from existence. The Sumerians built this, or perhaps they inherited it, or perhaps, and this is the unsettling thought the tablets leave unresolved, they were built by it, shaped generation by generation into a population that could maintain an order they did not choose, enforce a structure they did not design, and live within limits they could see but not question. The gods withdrew, the kings continued, the temples endured, the rituals persisted, and the enclosure remained, not because it was guarded, but because it was lived. If the enclosure was never meant to be escaped, what did freedom mean to the Sumerians themselves? The texts offer no answer, but the silence itself is revealing. Because if freedom was never imagined, if it was not a concept embedded in the language, the myths, the legal codes, the cosmology, then perhaps the deepest control is not what is forbidden. It is what is never conceived. And yet, something persists. Not rebellion, not revolution, not escape, but recognition. The Sumerian texts do not promise liberation. They do not describe a path out. They do not imagine a world restructured around human autonomy or transcendence, but they do contain something the system could not fully eliminate: the capacity to notice. In the debate between summer and winter, two seasons argue over which is more essential to human survival. The text is a scribal exercise, copied by students learning rhetoric. But embedded in the dialogue is a quiet acknowledgement. The seasons do not operate by human will. They follow cycles imposed from above. Humanity depends on forces it does not control. The text does not protest this. It simply observes it. In another work, The Farmer's Instructions, a father advises his son on agricultural techniques: when to plow, when to plant, when to irrigate. The language is practical, meticulous, but the final line is telling. My son, you should act accordingly. Not, you may choose. Not, you could innovate. you should act accordingly. The instruction assumes the framework is fixed, but it also assumes the son is capable of understanding it, of observing the pattern, of becoming aware that the pattern exists, and awareness, even without agency, changes something. It does not break the system, but it creates distance. The difference between performing a role unconsciously and performing it while knowing it is a role. This is not freedom in the modern sense, but it is not total submission either. It is the state of seeing the walls while still living within them. And this may be the closest the Sumerians came to what we would call existential clarity. Not the belief that the cosmos was just, or fair, or designed for human flourishing, but the recognition that it was designed, that the boundaries were drawn, that humanity was placed, not chosen. The planet-sized prison is not an accusation, it is a description. A reading of the texts that takes them seriously, not as metaphor, not as primitive misunderstanding, but as documentation of a worldview that prioritized order over openness, function over freedom, structure over potential. And the question is not whether the Sumerians were wrong. The question is whether they were describing something that still persists. Because when we trace the inheritance forward, through Babylon, Assyria, Persia, into the Hebrew Bible, the Christian cosmology, the Islamic framework, certain motifs remain intact. Humanity created to serve, earth as testing ground, heaven as restricted domain, the afterlife as fixed destination, laws handed down from above, time structured by divine calendar, kings receiving authority from a higher realm, disorder as threat, obedience as virtue. The language shifts, as the gods are renamed, the theology becomes more complex. But the architecture endures. Modern society has secularized the mechanisms. We no longer attribute laws to gods. We attribute them to constitutions, to institutions, to historical precedent. We no longer perform rituals to maintain cosmic order. We follow schedules, tax codes, employment contracts, social expectations. But the underlying pattern is familiar. Roles assigned at birth, labor structured by external calendars, literacy gate-kept by institutional access, populations managed through regulatory systems, deviation corrected through social, legal, or economic consequence. The temple has become the corporation, the ziggurat has become the office tower, the ration list has become the payroll system. And most people, most of the time, do not question the structure, not because it is enforced at gunpoint, but because it feels like reality. This is not to say the systems are identical. Modern life offers freedoms the Sumerians could not have imagined. Mobility, communication, access to knowledge. But the question remains, how much of what we call choice is navigation within a pre-existing framework we did not design and cannot fundamentally alter? How much of what we experience as autonomy is the illusion created by being allowed to choose between options that were already decided? The Sumerians, at least, were explicit. The texts state plainly, humanity was created to labor. The cosmos is enclosed. The gods set the terms. Obedience is function. We have softened the language, but have we changed the structure? Or have we simply internalized it so deeply that we no longer see it as enclosure, only as the way things are? The tablets do not answer this, but they do offer one final observation, quiet and unsettling. In the Sumerian king list, after cataloguing the reigns of kings before and after the flood, the text includes a phrase that scholars have debated for decades. The kingship was lowered from heaven. Lowered. Not seized. Not earned. Not built. Given from above. Installed. Transferred from a higher domain into human hands. And if kingship, the authority to organize populations, enforce laws, structure labor, manage resources, was not invented by humans, but received from an external source, then the question is not whether the system was designed. The question is, by whom and for what purpose? The Sumerians believed they recorded it carefully in thousands of tablets across hundreds of years. Humanity was created to maintain the earth. The gods established the order. The cosmos was divided into layers. Movement between realms was restricted. Limits were biological. Disaster was correction. Awareness was surplus. And the enclosure was not a punishment. It was the design. Whether we interpret this as literal history, cultural memory, or theological framework, the fact remains, the first civilization to write did not describe the world as a place of infinite possibility. They described it as bounded, regulated, and assigned. And 5,000 years later, we live in cities built on grids, governed by calendars we did not create, performing roles we inherit, moving through systems we navigate but rarely design. We do not call it enclosure, but we track our labor in lists. We measure our time in increments. We divide our populations into zones. We accept that certain realms, wealth, power, knowledge, are accessible to some and restricted to others. We look up at the sky and call it freedom, but we do not ascend. If the earliest civilization described the world as enclosed, and we still live inside its structures, are we discovering something new, or remembering something very old? The tablets do not tell us how to escape, but they do tell us how to see. And perhaps that is the only freedom that was ever available. Not the breaking of the walls, but the awareness that they exist.